She hid the diary in a drawer that no one opened for 30 years. The leather had gone soft at the corners. The glass of the ink bottle had a faint ring where a pen had once rested. On the last page, in an uneven hand that trembled with advancing age, a sentence waited like an accusation. What we did was monstrous. The year written below that line would be read aloud, if it were ever read, beneath a different sky. It bore the date 1888. 1888. The yard at Fazenda São Martinho woke that morning with a brittle silence, the kind that gathers after long use and before everything changes. Coffee trees stretched in rows toward the horizon, their leaves silvering in a wind that had known for decades the rhythm of labor and command. The terreiro, once full of bodies moving to orders barked by a fighter or the barão himself, had the hollow look of a place where roles had been played out for the last time. A few chests were already being loaded onto wagons. A woman folded a blanket and for the first time in her life set it aside as her own. The diary lay inside the big house, not locked but set where it could be missed, beneath a stack of accounts, under receipts folded from distant sales, under the detritus that accumulates when a life has been crafted to avoid looking back. For 30 years, a hand had written, corrected, hidden and rewritten the same story, the same self, in private. For 30 years, silence had been a shield for comfort. In those years, the house had kept its faces. Augusta Ferreira Braga, who would become the Baronesa. Barão Eugenio, husband and slow righteousness. Josefa, who began as a maid and carried the weight of others' hunger. Benedita, whose small features would grow into a likeness that whispered of secrets. Tiberio, whose absence would become a wound. Rufina and Quiteria, names that passed between the Cenzala walls like weather. But the pages of the diary belonged to one mind. The hand moved between denial and confession, the ink smudging where a fingertip had lingered over something the writer could not say aloud. The book was not an instrument of penance so much as a ledger, of events, of decisions, of a life arranged around the maintenance of a particular place and a particular reputation. 1856. Augusta arrived at São Martinho as a 17-year-old bride, though she would later write the age as 19, young enough to mistake ritual for reality. She carried trunks smelling faintly of lavender and hope, gowns folded in tissue paper, letters of introduction that made her the sort of person the family expected. Eugenio received her with parlor gravity. The house grande was polished, the silver gleamed, the servants bowed with the practiced obedience of those who had learned their place long before she understood hers. At first she saw the plantation as a stage, an ordered world where each role was clear. The Cenzala was something to be observed from a distance, shadows at the fringe of the estate. The whip was rumor, until she heard it. The first time her boots sank into the earth near the slave quarters, she felt the weight of eyes on her, curious, measured, cautious. Josefa was assigned to her, a woman with hands made for washing and mending, eyes that kept track of everything. Her speech was spare, her laugh infrequent. She arrived already mother to a child, and the child would later be called Benedita. Augusta wrote at the beginning with a confiding tone. The pages bear the freshness of someone cataloguing daily life as instruction. She recorded the names of servants, the hours of the day, the weather. She noted the baron's temper when the rains failed, the crop yields, the deliveries. She did not yet understand the logic of silence. How, in that house, to ask the wrong question was to unsettle the balance upon which her comfort depended. At first, the house taught her to look away. The whip cracked, a woman screamed, a door slammed. The household repaired itself. In time, keeping comfortable required not only silence, but clever forgetfulness. Augusta learned the vocabulary of omission. A complaint was a disturbance. A sale of a man or woman was a necessary adjustment. The words kept the ledger tidy. The diary shows this transition in small shoves. An early entry reads like a traveler's note. Today Josefa tended to the children's clothes. The barão is in a grim mood over the drop in prices. Later entries shorten. Observations become transactions. Guilt is delayed by a schedule. There is a sentence, then another, then a space where the pen stops and waits for permission to go on. She learned the social grammar of the baronial house quickly. There were breakfasts where Eugenio spoke of export routes as if he spoke of saints. There were visits from men whose pockets smelled of ink and money. There were evenings when the family sat to dinner under light that made their faces severe and respectable. Augusta found a strange power in the role she was taught, small commands to the maid, a correction delivered in public that settled the household like dust. She learned that a woman who maintained the house with decorum was less likely to be interfered with by scandal. Her interest in reputation hardened into a will to protect what appeared unblemished. Josefa, meanwhile, was the invisible measure of everything the house wished to avoid seeing. She bore what the house could not bear: the child, the labor, the grief. Her motherhood would be both solace and punishment. When Benedita was born, years before any public suspicion of her paternity, the household accepted the child's existence as a fact to be managed. Benedita was often near the great house, a small shadow at the hem of Augusta's skirts, a girl who learned early how to be seen without being spoken to. There were measures the house used to keep order that had nothing to do with law. A look could shut a mouth. A reproof could turn a servant's laughter into a habit of silence. Rufina learned the hard way what voices you could not afford to keep. The Cenzala watched one of its own taken away for a misdeed that had no witness but plenty of hearsay. The punishments were not always meted in public. Some were quietly administered on the sly, the kind that leave a woman's hands trembling for months afterward. When it came to gossip about the Baron's actions, the household had an unspoken rule: never give scandal more air than it must have to pass within the family. Augusta's entries during those middle years begin to show small cracks. A sentence appears about a late-night disturbance, Eugenio returning from the matas with a smell of smoke and a shadowed temper. Another line notes that Rufina was disciplined. The entry closes with a carefully chosen phrase about firmness. At one point she writes, "I cannot fathom his reason," and leaves the page as if the pen was heavy with something that could not be borne in ink and not intended to be carried beyond the margin. The Baron's presence in the house was a slow pressure. He was not a caricature of evil. He was a man shaped by the assumptions of his time, by an economy that made human beings fungible, and by a marriage that used a wife for appearances rather than intimacy. Eugenio exercised power with the same casual hand with which he managed plantations. He expected obedience in the bed as in the office. When youngsters were brought to his room under the pretext of household necessity, the house learned not to ask why. When injustices happened, Augusta learned to set them alongside her cups and saucers and make them part of the afternoon routine. There is in the diary an entry that would later haunt the pages. She said he was like the ocean, capricious, changing, impossible. This kind of language is the mask of someone who finds metaphors to keep from naming crimes. Augusta could, in the privacy of her room, describe the Baron's moods as weather. She preferred metaphor to accusation. It allowed her to keep the ledger balanced. If storms were natural, they were not her fault. Economics mattered. The coffee market could be merciless. Between the ledger and the field, lives were adjusted to suit the figures. Tiberio was sold. The transaction was recorded under accounts. Man sold to recoup losses. Augusta's writing about Tiberio is clinical. He was moved to another fazenda. The childless field hands were reorganized. She noted the sale, as one would note a shipment of goods. But the sentence had a margin of something else, a faint, almost invisible line in the ink where the pen had trembled. Tiberio's daughter, whose face had once turned to him with a trust that did not expect absence, would carry the loss as a question she had no right to ask. There are pages in the diary where the writer's hand is erratic. The pen darts and returns, as if reluctant to be left essential. She mentions the births of her own children, Henrique and Clara, and the tone becomes maternal in a way that separates her from those who did not share her name. Her affections gather around the legitimate line. The house became a place where maternal instincts were compartmentalized, sweetness applied to her own brood, strictness applied to those who had no claim on her affections. And yet the ledger that composes her life is not without moral awareness. The entries in later years are shorter, dense with guilt. There is an awareness that decisions had consequences. Once, she writes, "We are creatures of the rules we accept." It is a line that almost hints at responsibility, but she does not act on the line. She stores it in ink and moves on. The shift that would break something in the house was not sudden. It arrived like erosion, law, rumor, market, and the survival instincts of those who had little to lose. In 1871, the Ley du ventre libre rechanneled the structure of possession. A law that declared children born to enslaved mothers free under certain conditions did not overturn the logic of ownership overnight, but it worked like a slow ray cutting through a stained curtain. Augusta recorded the newspapers in the house with a mixture of curiosity and fear. She recognized a change that threatened the scaffolding of status. Others exploited it. Some feared it. Most learned to adjust their strategies within it. The Cenzala, meanwhile, became an island of conversation. Conversations in hushed tones slipped under the windows of the House Grande. Plans formed, small, cautious, practical. Whispers moved like currents. Which neighbor would try to run? Who would sell a person rather than risk a scandal? Some slips of paper carried names across miles. The Faitor, Thomas, watched and calculated. He could be cruel. His cruelty was instrumental, useful to keep labor in line and to shield the household from public embarrassment. He had his own ledger. Rufina's punishment was a pivot. She had been vocal, a dangerous quality under authority. The reason was simple and terrible. She had resisted an imposition not meant to be resisted. The house found an expedient, punishment in private, a glass of the Baron's contempt served like a medicine. Augusta's role in that moment is crucial. She could, in theory, have intervened, have raised her voice on behalf of Rufina. Instead, she ordered a chastisement, a correction that would leave Rufina altered. The diary records it with a mix of distance and rationalization. Firmness was required to avoid scandal. The same entry admits to sleeplessness afterward, a kind of private tremor that was, in effect, a confession of conscience unacted upon, the fateful secrecy unspooled in small domestic decisions. Benedita grew tall for her age. Observers noted a resemblance to Eugenio, not merely in bone, but in some manner of posture, the way she held a cup, or how her mouth angled when she smiled. Private whispers began in the quarters. Children noticed what grown-ups pretended not to see. Josefa, with the quiet dignity of her hands and the weathered softness of her face, kept watching her daughter as if waiting for an answer the house refused to give. The revelation of Benedita's paternity was not a dramatic denouement, but a slow arrival of a fact people had the courage to point at in different tones. A neighbor's comment, a look from a visiting lawyer, a servant's careless remark, these things combined into an understanding that could no longer be contained by euphemism. Augusta remembered the first time someone suggested, in an indirect way, that Benedita might be Eugenio's daughter. She wrote that she could not believe it at first. Then, noticing the way her own husband would look at the child, the belief curdled into recognition. Confrontation between husband and wife takes many forms. In this house, it was a negotiation over the boundaries of discretion. Eugenio did not apologize. He had never been required to. He preferred arrangements to explanations. When embarrassed whispers circled, he proposed a solution. Discretion, relocation, a specialized household. He wanted control without spectacle. Augusta negotiated with herself as much as with him. Her instinct, carefully honed, was to preserve what safety the marriage gave her, because to lose it would mean losing place and power. So she arranged in her mind and on paper ways to minimize harm to the family's reputation. It was then that the house forged a plan so ghastly in its logic that it was cloaked in a surprising domestic rationality. A house in the woods would be set up, away from gawking eyes. A room would be locked for certain women to be kept in private as needed. They would be fed, supervised, given tasks. They would not be subjected to public comment. The justification was one word: protection. It was practical, hygienic, discreet. It would cost money, but preserve dignity. Augusta agreed. She signed the ledger entries that allocated funds for maintenance, for a caretaker, for a schedule of visitors. In private, she wrote a few lines in the diary that tried to name what she had done without naming the crime. I made a choice for the household. I chose order over chaos. To herself she offered an ugly arithmetic: a few lives sequestered, a reputation preserved, the household intact. Her pen moved over the paper with a steadiness born of final decision. Josefa was moved into the fold of that arrangement, not by a single moment of theatrical cruelty, but by 1,000 small compactions of force. She obeyed orders because obedience had been the only way to keep her child from worse fates. Benedita, still young enough to be pliant and formed, was told to comply. Compliance would mean less attention, fewer daily humiliations. Yet what was offered as a solution was in fact a gilded form of captivity. The house in the woods had locks unknown to the law and rules of visitation, enforced by those protecting the baron's name. It was a private cage, administered with domestic efficiency. The diary records this chapter in compressed, detained phrases. Augusta wrote of management responsibilities and of feeling the weight of decisions. She penned in a later hand a line that would come back to haunt her. "We have done what seemed necessary." There is a tone of rationality, of a woman trying to remap her conscience in the language of stewardship. But the Cenzala saw differently. The people there, Rufina, Quiteria, Josefa, knew the world as a roster of losses and small resistances. They learned to read each other's faces for calls to action. The locked house created a new category of danger. It required loyalty from the caretaker, Tomas, and silence from those close to power. For those inside it, the place was a room without a window. For those outside, it was an erasure. As time passed, the House Grande continued its public life. Visits were received, cards exchanged. The baron's social circle saw the facade and accepted it. Augusta moved among her peers, her posture impeccable. She smiled when she mustered smiles and wrote letters to friends that carefully omitted the unpleasantness of the estate's undercurrents. Her child-rearing was proper, her dinner parties gracious. She cultivated a life that made history look respectable. Yet within the diary, the gate between facade and inner life narrowed until it was nearly invisible. There are entries showing suppression, names scratched through, sentences abandoned midline. The older Augusta began to use terse words, regret, necessity, difficulty, that signaled less denial and more maneuvering. She kept accounts of the household not as a record of sorrow, but as a ledger of obligations. Tiberio remained a gap. The sale had left its mark, a child's bed left cold, a father gone to a far fazenda where his name was a number among men traded like plots of land. The diary's pages remain precise about the economic need that motivated the sale, but vague about the human consequences. When Augusta wrote of Tiberio's absence, she focused on pragmatic difficulties and the reassigning of labor. In keeping the narrative as such, she protected herself from confronting the full scale of harm. There were also small tender entries that pierced the ledger's armor. On a morning when rain came early, she wrote of Josefa's hands, "That could close up a wound without asking for notice." A line like that betrays a complicated affection, a recognition of care given by someone she still believed she owned. The contradiction vibrated through the pages, how to praise a woman while complicit in her subjection. By the time she reached a line in the diary that reads, "I am tired of making excuses," the tone of private distress had shifted from confusion to a brittle clarity. Her handwriting grew less ornate. Ink blotches suggested a hand that shook in moments. There is a sense that the ledger became a confession by accident, a person cataloguing choices in the quiet, as if to have them be true, could eventually find the truth staring back. Yet confession did not become action. The diary, for all its admissions, remained inside a drawer. The habit of protecting one's place in a house does not fall away simply because a woman can, in private, call a thing monstrous. It was easier to record than to act. Easier to arrange a smaller beast than to uproot the structure of which she herself was part. This sequence of rationalization and small corrosive choices hardened into policy. When rumors explored Benedita's resemblance to Eugenio in more public spheres, the household moved fast to curtail exposure. The locked house was staffed. Visiting hours were organized. The world outside accepted the explanation of an extended family arrangement. The ledger balanced. Augusta slept in a manner that suggested she had not the courage to change. But the world kept grinding. Laws seeped into local consciousness like water under a floorboard. The ley du ventre libre, meant children born henceforth would not be slaves in name, an idea that reduced the certainty of futures built on bondage. Small acts of resistance occurred. Men vanished into the night and never returned. Women bolted with children under their arms and walked into an uncertain, free horizon. Those who remained had to choose between silence and a life of partial freedom. Within the house, tensions increased. For every outward show of control, there was a corresponding inward crack. The baron grew less invincible as market shifts squeezed the estate. He aged. The cough that had been a minor annoyance grew louder, his steps slower. In the rooms nearest his, the air smelled of camphor and of fear masquerading as care. Augusta took on a new role, keeper of a legacy that was no longer guaranteed. She wrote in the diary with a steadier hand about money, about accounts, about necessary sales. She also wrote at odd intervals about a growing emptiness in the house. In the evening, the patriarchal rituals continued, but their center had started to close like a pocket watch wound down. The locked house in the woods remained a secret tactic, a way to shield the family's private commodity from public view. It was a measure that protected some by harming others. The diary records the arithmetic without apology: fewer scandals, lower risk, stable heirs. That kind of thinking had been honed across years, in which small moral compromises stacked until they became an edifice. At the center of this edifice were two women, Josefa and Benedita. Josefa's interior life is threaded through the diary like a set of notes, some plaintive, some fierce. She kept her dignity in the ways she could, the manner of her speech, the way she tended a child, the private resistances that became small acts of defiance. Benedita, growing, carried the outward mark of lineage, like a banner she had not chosen. She learned the art of looking and not being looked at. She learned how to hold anger like a folded garment under her coat. Those were the years when silence did the most harm, when a woman could know the source of the harm and yet make arrangements that treated people as if they were ledger entries. Augusta's diary, with its arithmetic of necessity, would later be read as evidence of a mind that never fully crossed into action. And yet nothing in those years was complete. The house had not yet fractured entirely. The story that wound through the pages held a forward motion, a pivot that would not pivot if not for the ordinary courage of small lives. People outside the house, the ones who had no more to lose, had begun to act. The law, the market, the courage of a few, and the passing of time would converge to push apart the seams that had kept the house together. There was a night when Benedita, then in her late teens, sat by the kitchen hearth and listened to the older women speak. They named names. They traded small, practical knowledge. The talk turned to escape, to what might be done if one had the grit to walk away at dawn. Benedita, who had learned to weigh a look against a risk, asked a question that hung the room. If we go, what becomes of our names? Names in that society were what kept a person owned. To be called by a given name in the house was to have a fabric of identity woven for you by others. Benedita wanted to know if her name could be more than inheritance. The older women laughed with that sharpness that was equal parts hope and despair. Josefa said nothing then, but later she tucked that question into the corner of her daily life like a seed. And so the house continued, a web of small arithmetic and larger cruelties, a place where a diary could be opened and closed without the writer ever being required to speak the whole truth. Augusta kept writing, she kept accounting, she kept arranging, she kept the ledger safe inside a drawer. The locked house waited. The law waited. The market waited. The diary waited for its sentence to be read aloud. For now, the reader must stand at the threshold where choices accumulate. The story of São Martinho, of a woman who learned to manage reputation until reputation became her religion, of those who bore the cost of that religion, moves toward confrontation. It is the slow turn of many events, some law, some escape, some decision made in a corner of a room, that will set the stage for the diary to leave its drawer and be poured out into light. If this voice has found you in the hush of a room, and this story sits with you, stay a while. There are more hours ahead in which the ledger opens and names are spoken. If you want to follow the rest of this history, how private confession meets public consequences, subscribe for the next chapters. The diary waits for a reader. History waits for a reckoning. The house's choices had cost people their places, their peace, their children. The instrument of record, the leather-bound book, began to hold a different tone in its later pages. The entries shortened further. Where once sentences had been careful arguments, now single phrases signaled a mind that had grown weary of defending itself. Occasionally, Augusta tried a line of explanation. I did what was required to keep the family whole. Once she attempted a plea. I did not know how to be brave in the necessary way. She circled toward the same admission like a bird around a small fire. Something warmed her, then left her wanting. The plan for the locked house in the woods had been executed with the kind of efficient cruelty that makes ordinary people complicit. Tomas, the fighter, became its agent in the daytime. At night, he kept his own ledger of who left and who returned. He sent reports to the baron. He was rewarded for discretion. The women inside the house learned a new schedule of survival. They learned to measure their days in small brands of hope. A letter arrived from a distant cousin, a flower cut from the garden, a child's laughter slipping through a door. Those were the small things that kept a person sane inside an unjust cage. And yet, even in that place, human beings acted. There were gestures of tenderness that refused to be wholly smothered. Josefa, who polished Benedita's small shoes by hand. Benedita, who learned to stitch as if to bind together what could not be spoken. Those acts of care were not acquiescence. They were living where the world had not allowed fullness. They were a way to assert that a life, even when compressed, remained a life. Augusta watched, alternately proud and relieved that the household ran smoothly. She measured her days with the certainty that her children would inherit an estate intact. Inside the diary, she balanced that certainty against the sparse notes of discomfort, an ache that sharpened with each passing year. The fighter had a habit of tapping his fingers on the table when he felt a decision approaching. His tapping grew louder the day he reported a rumor. A man from a neighboring fazenda had left his wife and child and run north with a group. The market had dropped more than expected. More sales would be required. The baron's cough made his face hollow. A small, efficient panic spread through the household, such as it creates when the future is not as expected. Augusta wrote, in one late entry, of the necessity to maintain appearances while acknowledging the fragility of their fabric. She recorded the decision to sell a cow, to reduce the crew, to hold a small service in the chapel. She wrote these like one writes helpless lists. Near the end of the page, the handwriting thickened. For the first time, she jotted a line that did not rearrange the world into convenience. I'm afraid of what passes for my life. Fear is not the same as action. The diary is filled with fear that dissolves into preservation. The imprint of that pattern would be visible in years to come, the capacity to feel and to shrink in the face of consequences. It is what made certain choices seem plausible. It is what made silence look safer than truth. In the Cenzala, conversations shifted from what had been to what might be. The law, the foreign newspapers, a traveller's tale, they were all gnats against the night. But even gnats can make a man shift his sleep. People planned. People left overnight. Others, without the means or the chance to escape, held on. Josefa measured her options with a mother's arithmetic. Risk now with small chance of success. Risk later with a child grown but with less possibility of safety. She counted steps that had no obvious solution. Beneath it all, she knew a truth that time would teach her more sharply. That possession is a condition of language as much as law. From inside the house grande, the diary's voice softened. The rows of dates in the back were less frequent. Pages that once had the crispness of record-keeping were now the yellow of fatigue. Augusta's script moved toward a tone that was less defensive and more worn. She began to speak to an unnamed future reader, as if preparing an explanation she did not intend to give in life. One winter entry reads, "If one day someone asks me how I lived with what I knew, I hope the answer is mercy." It is a line that seeks absolution without offering restitution. Mercy in a house built on orders and sales was the thing wealthy people requested but seldom paid for. In the margins, she drew little maps of rooms, notes about locks. the names of those who had watched over the house in the absence of the baron. The diary had become a map of a moral geography she preferred not to traverse in public. Meanwhile, Benedita kept her own internal tally. She began to hate the ways she could not change the house's logic, and began to make a place for a future beyond what others assigned to her. She learned secrets, how to hide, how to move in ways that became small illegalities, borrowing notes, slipping a bread crust to a friend. In these acts, she practiced a different grammar, one for people who were not meant to be accounted for in the ledger. The late pages of the diary become paradoxical. The writer edges toward admission while clinging to the practice of rationalization. The timing of the eventual rupture would depend on many things: laws, markets, the death of those who had power, but also on the small things people with little to lose did when offered the first chance at freedom. And so the story turns toward a moment, a plan enacted in secrecy, a law changing the moral arithmetic of the region, the slow death of a man who had once seemed invincible. The household continued to rotate around rituals, dinner, morning prayers, accounts, but its axis had begun to tilt. The locked house in the woods awaited an uncertain future. The diary, its pages growing thinner, held the evidence of choices that would not be easily undone. In the next stretch of this history, the diary's last page will be found by a hand that was once ordered about. The reader will bring to that page a life shaped by the very ledger that hid it. The sentence that waits on the last line, "What we did was monstrous," will not heal the wounds it names. It will, however, give voice to a truth the house had worked so long to silence. But that revelation is not yet here. For now the house prepares, people make their plans, and the diary waits inside a drawer whose lock has been polished by years of use. The moment of reading is being assembled not by one person, but by the slow collision of many lives, some determined to hold on, some desperate to let go. The hinge of the narrative will come with a decision that is quietly made in the dark. It will be a choice that appears small to those who count in ledgers: which door to open, which name to keep, which child to let go. The house grande will keep its polish for a little longer. The Cenzala will plan. The locked house will stand in the woods like a secret shrine. And in the diary, the ink will keep the record of a woman who lived in the space between knowing and confessing, between acting and preserving. She wrote both to justify and to accuse. She wrote to leave a map, not of geography, but of conscience. When the house reaches the edge of ruin, when the market and laws and human courage conspire together, the drawer will be opened. A hand, one less accustomed to being ordered and more used to choosing, will lift the leather-bound book. The last page will be found. The sentence will be read. But that is a moment that belongs to 1888, to a morning when the world changed for those who had nothing left to lose. For now, the story must go back to the evening when a locked house was prepared, and a woman decided that discretion was a better fate than scandal. The choices made in that room set the terms of what would follow. Outside, the wind moved the coffee leaves like the turning of pages. Inside, Augusta closed her journal and laid it in the drawer. Her hand rested on the wood for a moment, as if testing its weight against the years. She did not yet know how inadequate ink would be to the work of what had been done under her name. She did not yet know who would one day read the last line. The ledger closed for the night. The house slept, measured and precise, while elsewhere small fires of possibility kindled in hands that had been taught to keep them hidden. The diary did not fly from the drawer like a confession demanding an audience. It slid into daylight because someone moved in habit and haste, because wood creaked at the wrong moment, because a life built on small routines finally misarranged itself. Between 1871 and the spring of 1888, the estate unmade itself by inches. The lait du ventre libre had not toppled São Martinho overnight, but it had begun to change calculations. Births were no longer purely domestic statistics. Men and women left when the nights offered roots and courage. Some neighbors sold fewer people and more land. Coffee prices dipped and rose like a heartbeat. The baron's cough sharpened into a breath that trembled. His steps shortened. Money, which had always been a kind of promise, became a brittle coin. Augusta kept accounting until the method of accounting no longer guaranteed outcomes. She made notes about creditors, about which parcels could be offered, which debts could be negotiated. The ledger and the diary sat in the same drawer, because she trusted her hand to both finance and conscience. She kept writing, not to unburden, but to chart. The entries became fewer as her body tired and as her appetite for self-questioning grew more complicated. When Eugenio's chest finally gave the small, long sigh of a man unstrung by age, the house marked the event in hushed, official tones. There were prayers, a curt procession to the little chapel, ointments dabbed at the temples. The household performed the rituals expected of a baronial family, because rituals preserved the appearance that governed their world. On the day of the burial, the Cenzala looked on from its distance. Josefa stood a step behind the others, holding Benedita's hand as people in black passed. Benedita, now a woman with an edge in her jawline, kept her face carefully composed. After the funeral, the house felt both lighter and emptier, like a music score after the conductor leaves the stage. Henrique, now grown into the practical posture of a son who had never been trained to feel beyond fiscal questions, began overseeing the disposition of the estate. He catalogued debts, negotiated with merchants, and took the measure of what could be sold with the least scandal. Clara, younger, spoke seldom, and floated through rooms like one of the curtains that had become faded. The family's public life adjusted, the household's private economies shifted. Tomas, who had kept his own small sections of power, counted wagons and men. He watched hands leave and return. He watched eyes that had once been lowered lift, however briefly. He kept a ledger, too, of favors gained and favors owed. His fingers, rough and sure, tapped the table when decisions needed to be made, and his mouth kept the quiet. He had long favored discretion as the more expedient cruelty. To do harm without television, without scandal, made it easier to return to normal. On the morning the Lei Aurea became law, the sense of something final moved through São Martinho like a wind that rearranged loose leaves. People gathered under different rules of life now. The old commands would not be enforced by the same legal machinery. Some would stay, some would go. For many, the law simply confirmed what they already knew. They had prepared for freedom as they could. Josefa had not pretended otherwise. She had taught Benedita how to sew a pocket that could hold a few coins. She had taught her to count the hours before dawn. She had taught her what to listen for in the night. The law was a key, but keys do not tell you where the doors are. On that morning, wagons waited around the terreiro and men moved with the purposeful economy of people who had learned the mathematics of leaving. Some carried trunks of linens, others small bundles of tools. Women folded what had been their beds and wrapped them as if they were gifts, as if the wrapping could change the nature of what was carried. The air smelled of dust and coffee and the iron tang of money. Children clung to mothers' skirts and tried to understand that the sky had not changed, but their days would. Augusta moved through the rooms with a hand that trembled on the banister. She had never been one to participate in the grunt of loading. She had arranged the order of things. Now she stood and watched the sequence of exits she had managed for years proceed in a new register. Her ledger, both the financial and the moral, sat heavy in her mind. She told herself to be practical. Practicality had kept her safe. Her face was the practiced face of a woman who had been taught that dignity could conceal the rawness below. That morning she tidied the desk near the window where the lamplight finally no longer hid dust but made quick, honest lines of it. She took out the diary to scan a list. Names, small notations of payments, the line that recorded a sale long ago. Things she thought she might need to show proof of transactions if anyone asked. In the hurry of final logistics, she folded a letter, signed a name, and set the book on the blotter. A visitor came to speak about carriage arrangements. A dispute about a chest of silver distracted a hand. A ledger needed a signature. Voices rose with calm urgency. Josefa had been told she could enter the house to fetch the last of her things. It was, in a sense, a benevolent permission, a signal that the household would not bar her from formally gathering what belonged to her. On other days, such permission came with an edge, a last demonstration of magnanimity. She stepped across the threshold with the quiet dignity she had always carried. Her hand, as it moved over cloth and vessels, brushed the blotter and found the book. She paused. For a moment she held the leather as if it were an unfamiliar weight. The book felt like a small possible answer. Josefa did not intend theft. She had learned long ago that objects carried meanings as much as utility. She opened the diary to a page near the back because the age of the paper suggested the newest confessions. Augusta had not locked the desk. Perhaps she had not expected anyone to take the time. Perhaps she had miscalculated the consequence of leaving a private record in a moment when public change was in the air. Those are the small gateways through which history sometimes turns, a drawer left in a hurry, a book that tastes of someone else's breath. Josefa read the first line in the quiet of the room. Her voice, low at first, carried a sound that had not been asked for by that page. A slow, simple reading, as if she were naming something out loud to make sure the words were true. The sentence she read, short, crisp, and unvarnished, fell into the room like a verdict. What we did was monstrous. The sound of those words did not explode. They landed. People heard them as if someone had taken a coat off and placed it on a table where everyone at last had to look at the stain. Augusta straightened, the signatures she had been making left unsmoothed. She had not imagined the line would be spoken aloud by one who had been so long reduced to silence. The color drained from her face in a slow, even wash. She moved toward the desk because some part of her wanted to retrieve the paper, not the words because words could not be retrieved, but the discretion that had protected her. The motion read to others as a guilty reach. Henrique stood with his hands folded. The arithmetic of his life required immediate measurement. There would be repairs to reputation, if such a thing were possible. There would be negotiations. There would be an accounting of what the family could concede to avoid scandal. He glanced at the men by the wagons, at the ledger, at the faces in the doorway, searching for a path that would keep the estate solvent. He was, in his way, the son who understood the language of division. Benedita cupped her own hands at her throat. The line had a different resonance for her, because resemblance had been the water in which she grew. She had suspected. The rumor had been a cast of small darts throughout her life, remarks from neighbors, the way a man's half-smile lingered too long. Yet hearing the sentence written by the woman who had arranged so much of her private life carried a new weight. It was not accusation in the public square. It was confirmation in the private ledger of the person who had orchestrated silence. That had its own bite. Padre Venancio, who had come that morning to attend to the dead and the living in equal measure, was near the threshold. He had been a voice of moral discomfort in years past. He had once asked questions that made Augusta shift uncomfortably in her chair. He did not speak then. His face showed in the soft lines near his eyes the weight of long observation. He had always been against euphemism. For a moment, nothing was said but the sound of an outside door closing as a wagon pulled away. The household's routine, so skillful at swallowing scandal, stalled. Josefa's hands, steady for decades, turned the page. There was more than the single line. She read on in a voice that narrowed and widened in the manner of someone moving between a private hurt and a public declaration. The diary at the end held small confessions that had been written in pen and fear, entries that admitted to calculations, phrases that tried to dress choices as stewardship, a fragment that read, "I chose the household." The full meaning of that sentence landed as a kind of trade-off, lives sequestered so that certain appearances could be kept. When the book closed, the room did not close with it. Exchanges began that were short and precise, the kind that occur when an old social order experiences at once a moral reckoning and a practical redistribution. Augusta stammered an explanation as if the act of speaking could reconstruct the ledger. She said words that were familiar from the diary: necessity, protection, reputation. But when she touched Josefa's hand, the touch felt, to those watching, like an attempt to return something unstated. Augusta's apologies, if they were offered, had the quality of late accounting, an attempt to balance columns by writing new entries. Josefa held the diary as though it were an instrument that could measure truth. She did not hand it back immediately. There was something in keeping the book that felt like a right. A life spent under the terms set by others gives one a clear sense of what is owed, if not to law, then to memory. Josefa turned to Benedita, and in a voice that did not rise, asked a question that had always lived between them. What do we do now? Benedita managed the old practice of controlled gestures. She walked to the window and looked at the line of departing wagons. Her future, until that morning, had been an imagined horizon made of work and small escapes. Now it hovered in the visible present. She answered calmly, with the sort of bluntness learned by those who must plan rather than dream. We leave. There was a negotiation then, not of the legal kind, because law had only contemporaneous teeth, rather a negotiation of things that would make departure possible. Henrique, cautious and perhaps shamed under his own understanding that the family's ledger now bore a stain beyond simple repair, opened a trunk and withdrew a purse. He counted with a steadiness that felt like a measure not of contrition, but of math. He handed coins to Benedita, and with less ceremony to Josefa. The amounts were neither ample nor obscene. They were enough to buy travel, enough to set two people with some small capital for a new start. In a voice that sought to be generous, he said the funds were for a new life. Beneath the phrase was the faint echo of financial pragmatism. Pay what is needed to make the inconvenience manageable. Augusta watched the exchange as if seeing the numbers on a page. Her hand, still tender with the diary's weight when she had it earlier, trembled now with the possibility of surrender. She set aside a small bundle of cloth, some linens she had not thought to apportion, and placed them in Josefa's keeping. The gesture was at once demeaning and strangely intimate, to decide what was given away and to choose it for someone else. It was not restitution in any full sense. It was a transaction made under social pressure and practical necessity. People spoke in clipped sentences, names adjusted on rolls, signatures given to release wages, a few legal formulas invoked about freedom and residence. Tomas counted the wagons again, his mind already back to the business of the land. He made arrangements for some who would be retained as paid labor. He recorded numbers and dates. For all his complicity, he knew that continuity required a practical engine. The estate would continue, but without the old certainty that human chattels could be traded like stock. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, freed people from other fazendas, a few curious onlookers. A woman who had long been silent, Rufina, walked by in a shawl and met Josefa's eye for the first time since her own punishment years earlier. The look between them was brief, but layered. Apology, recognition, solidarity. Some had left earlier, some had returned. The social fabric had been rewoven into lines that crossed the old scripts. When Josefa kept the diary, it was not to punish Augusta by pages alone. She had the practical sensibility of someone who knew that memory could be used. The book, in her hands, became a preserved record of authority and choices that had shaped their lives. She might preserve it as testimony, she might keep it as a witness against forgetfulness. In either case, the act of taking the diary was itself a reclaiming of narrative control, the person who had been catalogued, now catalogued. It was a moral shift of small but durable consequence. There was no dramatic confrontation, nor an immediate public trial. The law of the land had declared an end to slavery, but it had not created a mechanism to retroactively repair the particular harms done in private rooms. People left with their dignity and the belongings they could carry. Josefa placed the diary in a cloth and tied it to her bundle as if it were as necessary as bread. Benedita took her share of the coin and, with a steadiness that suggested both refusal and acceptance, prepared to walk away from the place that had forged and confined her. On the road out of São Martinho, Josefa paused at the gate and looked back. The house grande stood pale in the morning light, its facade still careful, its windows like eyes that had been trained to look away. She thought of Tiberio, whose sale years earlier had been recorded in dry accounts, and of the children who had been born into other owners' hands. She thought of the years of care she had given that had been returned in the form of small sums and a page. The diary in her bag weighed her down differently from a trunk. It was not only paper, it was testimony. The village received them with the sort of practical embrace that builds new lives slowly. Food was shared. A neighbor offered a small room. A woman who had once worked at a printing press said she could find Benedita some work sewing for merchants. The days ahead would be difficult. There were illnesses that required immediate care. There were debts owed to no one but the stomach. And yet the knowledge that their departure was not flight but a move into a new legal status changed things. The tense network of fear loosened marginally. Augusta remained in the house, smaller somehow, as if the rooms had shrunk to befit a woman whose authority had been unhinged. She set the diaries aside now with a different hand, less of a manager's claim and more of a person aware of the insufficiency of words. She tried speech in the days that followed. She spoke to Padre Venancio and to a neighbor. She spoke to herself in the diary. She wrote, in a hand less assured, a line that read like a plea, "If I could take back what we did." The sentence had the quality of a ritual, to name the wish that cannot be fulfilled. But Josefa had kept the diary. In a small room of the village she read it again for herself and for Benedita. They sat together and marked passages that mattered, those moments where Augusta had noticed and then turned away, where she had written, perhaps without full exculpation, "I am tired of making excuses." They read the passages quietly, not to reenact pain, but to own the record. For Josefa, the book was a map she could use to teach a different language to her children, if she had more children in the future, or to speak to neighbors who asked the truth about São Martinho. For Benedita, it was an assertion that lineage might be shame-bruised, but no longer invisible. Word of the diary's last line traveled with the rhythms of the village, sometimes as a gossip, and sometimes as a small, careful truth. It reached ears that had been dulled by time, and others that leapt at the chance for moral clarity. Some felt vindicated, some felt unsettled. Those who had been complicit in the house's operations met the news with quiet calculations, how to adjust credit lines, how to keep alliances. Stories do not simplify social calculations in a single day. Augusta, for all her private admission, was not undone by public knowledge. She continued to live out the remainder of her years, with a life circumscribed by what power remained in an aging person who had once administered many. She gave Benedita and Josefa coin, linens, and airy speech about beginnings, acts that could be read as remorse or as a last effort at neatness. The money did not erase what had been taken. It did not conjure back children sold or the privacy of a body. It did not absolve the system that had allowed people to be counted as assets. But it did provide the practical means for two people to begin, which matters in the arithmetic of survival. As for the diary itself, it became a small artifact of moral record. Josefa kept it in a place where it would be respected, where she could read it again to remember what to teach her children about names and choices. She sometimes opened it and read not to anticipate apology, but to remember the way silence had been used as an instrument of governance. She flipped through pages that recorded the births the Barreau had not publicly acknowledged and the sales that had removed fathers from bedsides. The edges of the paper, softened by travel, became a kind of palimpsest of their lives and the house's decisions. In the years that followed, people in the region told stories of São Martinho as both caution and lesson. There emerged slowly the sense that private decisions had wide public consequences, that a drawer left open could be a kind of revelation. Histories are rarely neat. They accumulate judgment in the retelling. Some neighbors excused Augusta as a product of her time. Others named her as someone who had chosen the logic of property above the logic of personhood. Both assessments lived side by side, and neither solved what had been done. The diary's last line, "What we did was monstrous," remained in the village's memory as more than a condemnation. It became for some a prompt. It asked how communities should record wrongs when laws move forward, but human habits remain the same. It asked what people owed each other beyond coins and polite words. People used the phrase to prod conversation at markets and laundries, in the chapel and in kitchens, not to indulge in moral exhibition, but to guard against future erasures. It became, in that small way, a civic instrument. Augusta died some years later, in a season where the estate had diminished and the list of her acquaintances had thinned. Her obituary in the local paper marked her as a figure of her class, a woman who managed her house and lived in the line of respectable society. The obituary did not speak to the other ledger, the one kept by a woman named Josefa, and inscribed upon a battered notebook of leather and ink. That ledger went on as a private witness. Benedita and Josefa made a life that was modest and durable. They rented a small room where Benedita sewed and Josefa took in washing. They had friends and moments of laughter. They suffered still, with the kind of grief that never fully leaves a body, dreams that occasionally collapsed into remembered rooms, a hand placed in the wrong way, a name that brought a chill. They learned to name themselves not by what had been taken, but by the work they would do, slow as it was. Once, when Benedita had a child of her own, she sat with Josefa and read to the small one from a book that had nothing to do with the diary, a story about a river that kept returning to the sea. They told that child a different kind of lineage, that love is not only inherited through blood, but is also chosen every day. The diary lay in a trunk beneath folded linens, a presence that had the steady clarity of an object that bore witness. In the later years, curiosity brought a neighbor to ask Josefa if she would consider reading parts of the diary aloud in a small gathering. Josefa considered. She was not interested in spectacle, but she also knew that the ledger needed to be heard. When she read, she did not read to inflame. She read in a voice that had learned to measure the balance between memory and mercy. She read the lines that were plain, those administrative notes, and finally the last sentence she had found on that morning in the House Grande. What we did was monstrous. The room where she read contained people of many kinds. Old servants, a few who had been children in the Torero, and a younger generation who had grown up after the law. The words made a sound in the room like the closing of a book. No one in that room expected the sentence to repair what was done. They expected it to be a small clarifying instrument. The reading did what records should do. It made an event resist the friendly softening of time. It named an act clearly so that later choices could be informed by an unflinching recognition. The diary never became an instrument of punitive law. It could not create retroactive justice. It did something else, valuable in its modesty. It rendered a private structure visible to those it had harmed. It allowed those persons some authority over the story, told about their lives. That authority did not take the form of official recompense, but of narrative control. Josefa would keep that control carefully, using the book to teach, to warn, and to solidify memory. There is a particular wound that money cannot close, and the villagers knew it. The sale of Tiberio could not be unsold. The years of coerced labor and broken families could not be reconstituted. A written line, however loud, cannot make a child who was sold come back. But the presence of the sentence in public speech, the act of making a ledger into testimony, did something else that mattered. It made the house's practices available to scrutiny and conversation. It shifted the burden ever so slightly toward accountability, if not legal then moral. Augusta's last notes, preserved now in Josefa's hands, show the arc of a mind that moved from denial to a brittle admission. It is tempting to narrate her life as a simple fall into guilt and then redemption. That would be dishonest. The diary shows a woman who protected herself in 1,000 small ways, who occasionally felt remorse, who sometimes wrote words that named pain and yet acted in ways that continued harm. Guilt exists in many forms, and in Augusta it was not always the impetus for change. The narrative of São Martinho, then, resists resolution in a single moral stroke. The people who had power and the people who suffered continued lives that intersected and diverged. Laws shifted, markets changed, families reorganized. Some made new alliances, some learned from the old ledger, some preserved it in the memory of the people who bore it in their bodies. If the diary taught anything, it was that silence is an instrument. Those who wield it may claim necessity, protection, or order, but when the moment arrives that requires naming, silence cracks. Names and pages and public words do not erase injury. They do something else. They make the truth more difficult to forget. Years later, when younger children in the village asked about the House Grande, adults would sometimes answer with a caution, the kind that passes on civil knowledge. "Remember the ledger," they might say, and then, with a softer voice, "Remember that what is done in private may not stay private." The phrase circulated like a small religious order, a moral practice, a civic ritual, a memory law. On a clear morning, long afterward, Benedita walked past the House Grande. Its shutters had been repainted. Someone else lived there now. She stopped and for a moment reached out and touched the iron gate. The contact was simple, human. She had in her pocket, folded and kept, A small slip of the diary, one line that she had transcribed for herself. It was not a weapon, it was a torch. She carried it to teach her child and perhaps to show the kind of careful memory necessary for a people rebuilding lives after a long era of being accounted as property. The leather-bound book that Augusta had hidden in a drawer for 30 years lay now intact in a chest in a modest house. Its last page had been read aloud by a hand that had once been commanded and had now taken the authority to speak. The words, "What we did was monstrous," had been spoken not as a magic that cleansed, but as a testimony that would be worked upon by memory and by the choices of those who had been wronged. Time does not produce justice automatically. It produces opportunities for different kinds of reckonings. If there is a lesson in the turning of this story, it is not a tidy moral for easy consumption. It is, rather, the slow lesson that private confession, if withheld too long, cannot stand in for restitution, and that public law, if unaccompanied by social change, leaves many injured in its wake. It is the lesson that those who keep ledgers must be compelled to account, not only in ink, but in tangible repair. It is also the lesson that those who were once denied voice can reclaim stories by simple acts, by reading, by keeping, by naming. The diary's final page remains as it was read in 1888, short, blunt, and true enough to make air around its shift. It is evidence of choices and a prompt to memory. In a region rebuilt from the stubborn rubble of practice and law, the small act of reading that sentence aloud produced a ripple. Small, necessary, human. If this story reached you and made you hold a thought about how private acts become public debts, leave a comment with what stayed with you and subscribe for more stories that keep history honest.